So I'm just going to really hit some of the highlights of the key themes that we as a community have pulled together and that many of our panelists have underscored today. Can we go to the next slide? So first, it's why accelerated approval works for rare disease, why it matters to our community. As we know, there are an estimated 7,000 to 10,000 rare diseases. And using that 7,000 number, we believe that there are more than 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. In 2020, the Relay Foundation worked with the broad community to establish some real data around the economic impact of living with a rare disease. And in 2019, we found that of 379 diseases that we looked at, that impact was $1 billion. And what's more important to consider is that 60% of that impact were costs incurred directly by families, not direct health costs, but costs that are coming out of the pockets of American families. Of those rare diseases, more than 50% are pediatric onset, and many are rapidly progressing fatal diseases. And fewer than 5% of those disorders have FDA-approved therapies. We have a public health crisis in the US of rare disease that deserves the urgency and innovation of the accelerated approval pathway. Next slide. So this is just more of that data that shows that even within the 40% of those direct costs, we spend a lot of time in Washington talking about policies to really target those direct costs. But the cost drivers are not therapies. The cost drivers are inpatient admissions, outpatient admissions, the diagnostic odyssey, which we could do so much about. There is so much more we could be doing to better serve our rare disease community, including protecting and expanding the incentives to develop effective and safe therapies for the rare disease community. Next slide. So let's talk about the scientific rigor of the accelerated approval pathway. And we've heard this spoken to so many times by so many of the panelists here today, that therapy development using biomarkers is not a compromise. And in fact, surrogate endpoints are validated measures that are backed by science. And in many of the diseases in our rare disease portfolio, these surrogate endpoints or these biomarkers can more accurately capture what's happening within our rare diseases. They are closer to the underlying cause of disease and can be tracking the real-time disease progression better than clinical data. And that well-established biomarkers have enabled other pathways such as oncology and HIV, as Dr. Raju so eloquently pointed out, to be transformed. And as Dr. Unger showed, that the accelerated approval pathway is subject to the same statutory standards and regulatory rigor as more traditional approval pathways. Next slide. So let's talk about safety. The rare disease patient community wants safe products as much as we want effective products. And the safety of rare disease treatments are viewed through the context of the benefit risk framework for each patient population. Pat and Tiana just spoke about the nuances and the progression within their respective disease communities. And the FDA takes that into account. They understand the benefit and risk of each patient community as they look at the therapies coming through the pipeline. And the trial outcomes for any of the trials that are considered by FDA are carefully considered and weighed against the known natural history and disease progression. And as actually something that Pat often says, and the certainty of doing nothing. And so when we think about that 70% that's been talked about today, what we do know in rare disease is what happens the 100% of the time that we do nothing in our rare diseases. We also saw data today that showed that more than 75% of products approved for the accelerated approval pathway have been converted to traditional approvals. Next slide. So let's talk about access. Tiana really ended on an incredibly important point that approval does not equal access. And if the products that are approved that are deemed safe and effective for patients with rare diseases don't make it into the hands of the patients who are eligible, this is all for naught. We have some really important evidence that has shown that delaying and preventing access to patients, first of all, is not ethical, but it is also, we are not causing a huge impact on the ecosystem as far as pricing is concerned. So we have evidence that Ken Thorpe and colleagues showed that within the Medicaid setting, drugs approved via the accelerated approval pathway accounted for less than 1% of annual Medicaid spending in between 2007 and 2018. We must do better to ensure that products that are approved via the accelerated approval pathway make it into the hands of patients. We also cannot have two separate adjudication processes in the US. Once a product has made it through FDA's regulatory rigor and has met the statutory approval standards at FDA, that product must have access and not be subject to an additional adjudication process within the access environment. Next slide. So as a community, we've come together to identify some opportunities to strengthen and protect our accelerated approval pathway that really reflect what we understand about the pathway. So the first is that we need to support the prioritization of resources and collaboration necessary to advance knowledge on rare disease biomarkers and intermediate clinical outcomes. We've seen that for the many rare diseases coming through, we have very limited endpoints, biomarkers, and outcomes that are approved. We need to protect and strengthen the existing incentives for therapeutic development in rare disease, including the orphan drug tax credit, which is an incredibly important life-saving therapeutic development incentive for the rare disease community. As I just spoke to, while protecting the statutory role of the FDA, we need to look for opportunities to facilitate earlier payer engagement around the selection and use of endpoints and surrogate biomarkers in clinical studies and regulatory review prior to regulatory approval, so that those discussions with payers don't happen at the point of post-market approval. There were discussions to the next point around confirmatory trials. We've seen data around the conversion of products from accelerated approval to traditional approval, but we also need to identify opportunities for confirmatory trial process improvements through more structured and earlier stakeholder engagements in the pre-market setting. We also have to understand how complex conducting clinical trials, confirmatory trials are within rare disease, and understand that post-approval randomized controlled confirmatory trials often pose ethical challenges when there is no longer clinical equipoise. So we need to look at ways of approaching these clinical trials in a way that is ethical to the rare disease community. And we also need to, based on what we heard today, around the 70%, perhaps we're seeing evidence to support more evidence, more guidance around what is considered reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Perhaps 70% is an important threshold to be considering. And then we need to enable broader use of real-world evidence to satisfy post-approval confirmatory requirements. I think most importantly, what we know is that the accelerated approval is working as intended. It's delivering better health to those in dire need. We must value and protect it for the benefit of all patients where opportunities of accelerated approval have yet to be realized. We need more incentives, more approvals, and more access.